The individual recognized historically as Reinhard Heydrich was born in Halle der Saale, Saxony-Anhalt, Eastern Germany, on March 7, 1904. Heydrich was the complete name of Reinhard Tristan Eugen. His father, the renowned composer and opera singer Richard Bruno Heydrich, named his eldest son Reinhard after the protagonist of his inaugural production, Amen. Additionally, Tristan and Eugen, Reinhard's middle names, were derived from Richard Wagner's opera Tristan and Isolde, and Eugen Krantz, his maternal grandfather, was the director of the Dresden Royal Conservatory. Elisabeth Anna Krantz, the mother of Reinhard, was the progeny of the previously mentioned Eugen Krantz. Her ancestry was prosperous. Richard and she first encountered during his time as a student at the Dresden Conservatory, an institution presided over by her father at the time. Reinhard was the eldest of 3 children. A year and a half later, they welcomed a younger son named Heinz, and then they welcomed a daughter named Maria. Reinhard enjoyed a relatively privileged upbringing, as he was the progeny of a renowned composer who concurrently held the esteemed position of director at the Halle Conservatory of Music. Bruno Heydrich, the pseudonym of Richard Heydrich, was a nationalist who inspired his sons with a deep affection for Germany. Early on, Reinhard demonstrated promise in numerous spheres of endeavor. He developed into a proficient swimmer in addition to being an accomplished student and athlete. An influence of his parents on his musical sensibilities resulted in his mastery of the violin and the piano, the latter of which he performed with notable proficiency. Nevertheless, Reinhard also encountered adversity throughout these years. Primarily due to his purported Jewish heritage, he endured victimization at school. Early in the 20th century, anti-Semitism was widespread in much of Europe, and it was said that the Heydrich family was descended from Jews. This hypothesis appears to have been formed in the 1870s through the matrimonial union of Gustav Robert Suss, a locksmith, and Reinhard's paternal grandmother. Reinhard was not, in fact, Richard Heydrich's grandson, as this individual became his stepfather. Furthermore, Suss was a Protestant whose name merely had a Jewish pronunciation. However, Reinhard was ridiculed at school by his classmates as Moses Hundel. The snide remarks concerning his purported Jewish heritage would have a profound psychological impact on him. Early adolescence and youth was spent by Reinhard in the midst of conflict. Political tensions between the great powers, fueled by nationalism, colonial competition in Africa, and the formation of 2 armed military alliances, had transformed Europe into an explosive keg at the time of his birth. An alliance between the Empire of Austria-Hungary and Germany formed one side, while Britain, France, and Russia formed the other. Numerous regional conflicts throughout Europe and Africa consistently posed the risk of escalating into full-scale war. However, these were frequently averted until the summer of 1914, when a political crisis emerged in the Balkans with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austria-Hungarian Empire, by a Serb nationalist. What had begun as a regional crisis escalated into a continent-wide act of saber-rattling in the weeks that followed. This escalated into a continent-wide war in early August 1914. Although the First World War had begun, Germany was not positioned favorably. In 1917, following years of impasse along the Western Front in northeastern France, the United States allied itself with Britain and France to join the conflict. This, coupled with domestic political unrest in Germany, led to the collapse of the German Empire, and Wilhelm II abdicated in November 1918. A year later, via the Treaty of Versailles, a new German republic bearing the name of Weimar was formed, which acquiesced to peace terms that were so severe as to be debilitating. After the conclusion of the conflict, Germany was afflicted by significant unrest. As a result of the success of the Socialist Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in late 1917, a vast number of German workers attempted to exert pressure on the nascent Weimar Republic to adopt a more progressive course of action. However, a significant portion of the right-wing populace reacted angrily to these efforts. A significant manifestation of this social unrest transpired in January 1919 in Berlin, where an estimated 50,000 communists, headed by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg and identifying as the Spartacists, staged a rebellion and issued threats to seize control of the state. The 12th of January marked the successful suppression of the Spartan revolt by the government Armed Freikorps or Freikorps, an organization composed of tens of thousands of ex-soldiers. In the years that followed, the Freikorps became an integral part of German society, as the Weimar Republic utilized them to quell labor movements and disturbances wherever they occurred. Heydrich, who had recently reached the age of 15, quickly became involved in Merker's Volunteer Rifles, a Freikorps detachment stationed in Halle subsequent to the town's occupation by insurgent communists. The predominant factor in quelling the labor unrest in Halle during the spring of 1919 was this unit. Heydrich would later assert that his political sensibilities were profoundly influenced during this period in 1919. Since their inception, those sentiments had been deeply anti-Semitic. Early in the 20th century, prejudice against Jews was all too common in Europe. In fact, Jewish communities throughout the continent had endured expulsions, pogroms, and persecution in countries such as England, France, Spain, Portugal, and Germany since the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, antisemitism such as that of Heydrich was not uncommon in Weimar Germany. However, its severity was unparalleled. Heydrich became a member of the Deutsch-Völkischer Schutz- und Trutzbund, the German Nationalist Protection and Defiance Federation, in 1919, shortly after its formation in Bamberg that spring. The organization's motto was Deutschland den Deutschen, or Germany for the Germans. The federation was one of the most virulently anti-Semitic movements in post-war Germany from its inception. At that time, many were quick to accuse the Jewish people of causing Germany's defeat in the conflict and its subsequent humiliation. Determining the origin of Heydrich's radical antisemitism is a challenging task. Undoubtedly, his parents did not harbor particularly anti-Semitic sentiments. In fact, during the 1910s, his father leased a tiny room in the Halle Conservatory to a Jewish merchant from the neighborhood. Instead, Heydrich's convictions were influenced by the burgeoning anti-Semitic sentiment that pervaded Germany in the aftermath of World War II. Reinhard resolved at the tender age of 18 that he would enlist in the German Navy. This was not a simple position to attain in and of itself. As per the provisions outlined in the Treaty of Versailles, the Reichsmarine, which had recently been established, was restricted to a complement of 15,000 Marines, lacked submarine capabilities, and could only maintain a maximum of 6 battleships of the Dreadnought class. However, the upper-middle-class heritage and connections of Heydrich's family secured him a cadetship at the Kiel Naval Base in northern Germany, close to the Danish border. He was promoted to the rank of senior midshipman in the spring of 1924 and subsequently assigned to the officer training base located at the Merwich Naval Base in Kiel. Following a 6-month training period on the flagship of the North Sea Fleet, the SMS Schleswig-Holstein, in 1926, he was dispatched on a training cruise to the western Mediterranean, where he visited Portugal and Spain. Heydrich received commendation during this period for his development into a respectable officer, and by the summer of 1928, he had attained the sub-lieutenant rank. Moreover, he harbored ambitions. A childhood acquaintance who encountered Heydrich during a momentary visit to Halle at this juncture remarked that he had expressed a hope to attain the rank of admiral in the future. While Heydrich was still acclimating to life at sea, indications of a potential future for Germany emerged in Bavaria, a southern region of the country. In the post-war period, a significant number of German soldiers experienced profound dissatisfaction with the peace agreement. As per the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was obligated to conduct a complete military disarmament, retaining a mere 100,000 men, in addition to bearing the burdensome restitution for the conflict. In the early 1920s, when these were intermittently unpaid, the French occupied portions of western Germany. Many individuals, including Heydrich, who had joined a peripheral political organization like the Freikorps in 1919, had become enraged by this and had begun to do the same. Small political parties that desired a revision of the post-war settlement and a revitalization of German national pride persisted throughout the 1920s. Bavaria was the birthplace of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, which was commanded by Adolf Hitler, an Austrian-born war veteran. They would go so far as to attempt a military rebellion in the city of Munich in November 1923 in pursuit of their objectives, but this was before the true conflict could commence. Following this, Hitler and a number of other members were apprehended. However, despite the government's inability to completely eradicate the party, it would resurface decades later as a political entity that would appeal to Heydrich. Heydrich's ascent to the Nazi Party was influenced in significant ways by his personal shortcomings in the Navy, with his extracurricular pursuits frequently inciting unrest. Heydrich had incited disturbance at a naval base in 1926, during his tour of the Western Mediterranean and Atlantic, when he became agitated over the refusal of the wife of a British officer to dance with him. By the late 1920s, he had acquired a notoriety as a serial philanderer, characterized by an extensive series of extramarital affairs, frequently involving married women and frequently with multiple women concurrently. Furthermore, it was reported that he had developed an intolerable sense of arrogance towards his subordinates. Furthermore, his primary focus appeared to have shifted from his naval responsibilities to recreational activities like rowing. Early in 1931, it was disclosed that he had made a solemn commitment to marry a particular woman, but subsequently reneged on that promise in favor of Lena van Osten, the progeny of a minor German aristocrat whom Heydrich had encountered in December 1930 at a rowing ball. In some common law jurisdictions during the early 1930s, this type of violation of promise remained a criminal offense, and Heydrich's April 1931 discharge from the Reichsmarine for conduct unbecoming of an officer was sufficient evidence of its gravity. In the spring of 1931, Heydrich was expelled from the Reichsmarine, an event that marked a turning point in his life. Nevertheless, he had ultimately instigated it upon himself. During the inquiry into the alleged relationship between Reinhard and the young woman, whose identity remains enigmatic and who claimed to have been proposed to, Reinhard made a concerted effort to mislead the investigative panel comprised of Gustav Kleikamp, the training officer, Admiral Gottfried Hansen, and Hubertus von Wangenheim, the most senior member of Heydrich's crew. Instead of acknowledging accountability for the events that transpired, Heydrich asserted that the woman was to blame for initiating their relationship and exerting pressure on him. Upon discovering that this was unequivocally untrue, Heydrich declined to acknowledge his actions. The investigative panel termed this proven insincerity, and it was because of this that they were compelled to discharge him from the Navy. Heydrich did not react favorably to the decision. Later, his future wife, Lena von Osten, remarked that it was the heaviest blow of his life, and that he sobbed uncontrollably and pitifully in his chamber for days. He unsuccessfully petitioned German President Paul von Hindenburg to investigate the situation. Considering the profound psychological impact that this incident caused, it is perhaps unsurprising that he would embark on an entirely different career path within weeks. It was this change that would shape the course of his life and have ominous repercussions for substantial portions of the population in Central and Eastern Europe in the years that followed. Amidst Heydrich's meteoric rise and decline from power in the Navy during the late 1920s and early 1930s, the nation's political landscape was undergoing a significant transformation. Midway through the 1920s, Germany experienced a period of political stability due to robust economic expansion, mirroring the worldwide economy's condition throughout the Roaring Twenties. However, much of this global expansion was predicated on speculative investments, and by autumn 1929, the New York stock markets on Wall Street had begun to decline, resulting in enormous losses. This marked the onset of the Great Depression, which affected the economics of Europe and the Americas. Germany was hit especially hard, and millions of people had lost their employment and life savings by the beginning of the 1930s. Extremist parties, as is frequently the case in such circumstances, managed to capitalize on the unrest for their own benefit. An example of such a group in Germany was the Nazi Party, whose leader Adolf Hitler had previously attempted a military putsch in Munich in 1923. Prior to the Reichstag elections of September 1930, they were a pitiful organization that could generate no more than 2% of the national vote. However, after winning 18% of the vote, they were elevated to the position of the second largest party in Germany. They would sustain their rise to prominence in the years that followed by capitalizing on the German people's resentment and despondency regarding the economic situation. Heydrich joined the Nazis shortly thereafter. Politically, they mirrored the Deutsch-Völkischer Schutz und Trutzbund, an organization he had previously affiliated with in the early 1920s. Characterized by a pronounced anti-Semitic position and a conviction that Germany belonged to ethnically German individuals, they espoused a nationalistic stance along racial lines. Upon their encounter in December 1930, Lena von Osten had been an adherent of the Nazi Party for a significant duration, having enrolled more than a year prior in 1929. Although Heydrich likely did not require much persuasion, she likely played a substantial role in influencing him to formally join the party on June 1, 1931, the day following his formal expulsion from the Reichsmarine. The Schutzstaffel, SS, which translates to protective echelon, was one of the two principal paramilitary organizations affiliated with the Nazi Party. The other was the Stormtroopers, SA, which he joined 6 weeks later. The SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, expanded significantly to emerge as a dominant force in Germany. Heydrich was classified as member number 10,120 and 544,916 of the Nazi Party. The subsequent day, December 26, 1931, saw his matrimonial union with Lena. Klaus, Heda, Silke, and Marte, their 4 children, were born intermittently between 1933 and 1942 into a family that was devoted to the Nazi cause. In the course of 1931, Heydrich's life trajectory underwent a significant transformation. However, he was presently unemployed, despite the fact that his discharge from the Reichsmarine had stipulated 2 years of severance pay. A position presented itself to him while he was still subsisting on this salary. It originated within the Nazi Party. In the summer of 1931, around the time that Heydrich joined both the party and the SS, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, sought to establish a counterintelligence branch for the paramilitary organization that could operate against centrist and leftist groups attempting to obstruct the Nazis' ascent to power. Karl von Eberstein, a native of Halle whose mother was also Heydrich's godmother, advised Himmler shortly after Heydrich joined the SS that he stood a suitable candidate for a prominent position within this newly formed counterintelligence unit. Furthermore, he had a personal connection with Heydrich's future spouse, Lena, and was therefore delighted to arrange the encounter between Himmler and Heydrich. Indeed, this transpired in Munich, where Himmler was so taken aback by the proceedings that he appointed Heydrich as the leader of the SSIC service, formerly referred to as the Intelligence Service, but more commonly known as the Sicherheitsdienst or SD, Security Service. Heydrich was obligated to relocate to Munich with Lena within a few days of accepting the offer for the new position. He commenced operations from the Braun House, a mansion situated on Königsplatz in Munich that had been acquired by the Nazis in 1930 for their new headquarters, on August 1, 1931. Initially, Heydrich encountered difficulties in his position, which included sharing a typewriter with another SS member and receiving meager compensation. However, conditions gradually improved over time. Heydrich devoted the majority of his time to shadowing Nazi Party members. Concerns arose during the late 1920s and early 1930s due to the party's explosive growth, which sparked suspicions that a significant number of new members, and perhaps even some Reichstag deputies, had joined for career reasons without a strong ideological adherence to the Nazis. Additionally, there were suspicions that state security officials or members of the Communist Party were infiltrating the party. Simultaneously, the SD was tasked with arranging the necessary logistics to initiate its own intrusion into the state security apparatuses. Late in 1931, Heydrich assumed command of an intelligence network dedicated to these endeavors and commenced compiling dossiers on centrist politicians with the intention of blackmailing or exploiting them in the coming years. Himmler was extremely pleased with this early work, and in December, in honor of Heydrich's matrimonial union with Lena, the SS leader bestowed upon him the honorific SS Sturmbannführer rank, which is equivalent to that of a major. Heydrich was gaining prominence within the party that was on the verge of seizing power in Germany. In response to the increasingly bleak national economic outlook, Reichstag elections were scheduled for the summer of 1932. The Nazis gained 230 seats out of the 608-seat parliament and nearly doubled their vote share from the 1930 election, increasing their majority by 37%. As a result, they became the largest political party in Germany. The more centrist parties, on the other hand, were determined to prevent Hitler from becoming Chancellor of Germany, and Hitler refused to accept a subordinate position in a coalition government. Consequently, Chancellor Franz von Papen assembled a haphazard government, but it was similarly powerless to avert the economic and political crisis, and additional elections in November 1932 were unsuccessful in breaking the impasse. Amid this deadlock, in January 1933, a broad coalition of German centrists and business elites reached an agreement with the Nazis. Hitler would become Chancellor of Germany, and the Nazis would receive a series of ministerial briefs. The objective was to maintain control over Hitler and stabilize the country's politics, but this proved to be completely unattainable. A fire at the Reichstag prompted the Nazis to fabricate a political emergency within weeks. This pretext was utilized to pass the Enabling Act in late March 1933, which effectively authorized Hitler to rule by decree. The Weimar Republic ceased to exist. Heydrich had the potential to attain a position of considerable authority within the security apparatuses of the nascent state. However, in 1932, during the party's final drive for power, his very existence within the Nazi Party came into jeopardy. Resurfacing that year were allegations regarding Heydrich's partial Jewish heritage, the same allegations that had gotten him ridiculed in Halle for being Moses Hundel when he was in school. This was a particularly inflammatory allegation for a high-ranking member of the SS, an organization that allegedly took pride in its impeccable reputation as an organization comprised solely of German Aryans and whose mission was to ensure the future racial purity of Germany. Such a claim befitted a member of the Nazi Party. Politically motivated, the allegations against Heydrich originated among party members whom he had provoked in the years since joining the SD through his counter-intelligence work. However, they were unsuccessful. Heydrich was exonerated of the charge of racial impurity by the autumn of 1932 following an investigation by Achim Gurke, the Nazi Party's primary investigator of such matters. Himmler further elevated him to the position of SD chief. Following the ascent to power of Hitler and the Nazi Party in early 1933, and subsequent resolution of the racial impurity charges, Heydrich was positioned favorably to advance rapidly within the security apparatuses of the nascent Nazi state. Himmler and Heydrich supervised the formation of the Bavarian political police, which effectively subjugated the police forces of Munich and other municipalities in southern Germany to the SS and SD, within weeks of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. Heydrich, supervised by an expanding staff of officials, initiated the development of a card index of the regime's political adversaries in Bavaria during the subsequent weeks and months. This index included trade union activists and labor organizers, Jewish leaders, journalists openly opposed to the Nazis, communists, and any other overt adversary of the Nazi regime. Together, he and Himmler were instrumental in the construction of a novel concentration camp in the vicinity of Dachau, situated beyond Munich, where political adversaries were subsequently incarcerated. During the mid-1930s, concentration camps emerged as a recognizable symbol throughout Germany, functioning as makeshift correctional facilities modeled after military compounds. Thousands of individuals were detained in these camps, frequently without justifiable legal grounds for their imprisonment. The progress observed in Bavaria was not unique to the rest of Germany. His Göring, a prominent Nazi official and minister of state in Prussia, which dominated a significant portion of the country's north and east, established the Geheime Staatspolizei, or secret state police, to function as a counterpart to the SD in Prussia. It is more notoriously referred to by its abbreviated form, Gestapo. In 1933 and 1934, this was largely the result of senior Nazi officials such as Göring and Himmler attempting to stake out their own power blocks within the new Nazi state. Thus, Göring was initially hesitant when Wilhelm Frick, the Reich Interior Minister, attempted to begin integrating these disparate police forces into a national police service in early 1934. He believed that Himmler was attempting to outsmart him and seize control of the Gestapo. However, by late spring 1934, his attention shifted to another matter, specifically his aspiration to supervise the establishment of a novel German Air Force. As a result, he reluctantly consented on April 20, 1934, to Himmler assuming command of the Gestapo. Himmler appointed Heydrich as the organization's leader 2 days later. As a result, Heydrich assumed the dual role of the SD and Gestapo chief, effectively establishing himself as the preeminent counterintelligence and secret police official within the nation. Upon assuming his recently acquired position of authority, Heydrich was promptly entrusted with a senior responsibility aimed at subduing a paramilitary faction affiliated with the Nazi Party. Storm Detachment, or Sturmabteilung or SA for short, had expanded significantly during the early 1930s under the command of Ernst Röhm. In 1934, stormtroopers comprised more than 2 million individuals. However, this figure could be estimated to reach 3 to 3.5 million if the technically subordinate SS and other organizations were incorporated. His sense of personal authority within the Nazi regime had correspondingly increased, and Röhm had developed a growing disdain for Hitler and others. Hitler resolved to act in the late spring of 1934, as Himmler and Heydrich was seizing control of the Gestapo from Göring. Heydrich played a crucial role in compiling a list of prominent SA figures that would require purgement to render the organization ineffective. Then, on June 30, 1934, an outbreak of attacks that later became referred to as the Night of the Long Knives occurred. Alongside nearly 200 others, Röhm was apprehended and executed without trial. The SA was significantly neutralized and transformed into a primarily sporting organization in the months that followed, whereas Himmler's SS became the dominant military branch of the Nazi Party. Heydrich possessed tremendous influence following the events of the Night of the Long Knives. At this time, Himmler presided over the SS and the German police agencies. Heydrich, operating under his direct supervision, was essentially his second in command with regard to the SD and the Gestapo. Thus, although Himmler pretended to be in charge, Heydrich oversaw the operations. During the mid-1930s, he undertook the development of an exceptionally sophisticated state security apparatus, which was built upon an expanded iteration of the card index system he had created in Munich a number of years prior. Hundreds of thousands of alleged political dissidents were monitored using this method, while tens of thousands were apprehended and extradited without charges to the expanding network of concentration camps that had been established throughout Germany to house enemies of the Nazi regime. Additionally, Heydrich was constructing a network of loyal individuals in command of regional bases. Prominent individuals included Heinrich Müller, a former Bavarian police detective recruited by Heydrich as a senior official in Munich, and Adolf Eichmann, a meticulous bureaucrat who enlisted with the SD in 1934 with the responsibility of surveilling the activities of suspected German organizations such as the Freemasons. These two individuals would have a substantial impact on subsequent occurrences that Heydrich was at the forefront of. During the 1930s, as Heydrich rose through the ranks of the German security services, the Nazi regime prepared for war. Hitler and his cronies ascended to power in 1933 with the explicit intention of instigating a fresh European conflict in order to re-establish German dominance throughout the continent. Having originally envisioned the commencement of such a war in 1941 or 1942, They were cognizant of the fact that the militarily weakened condition of the country would necessitate many years before it could be executed. In pursuit of this objective, the Nazis initiated covert military expansion in Germany in 1933. By early 1935, they declared publicly that they were exceeding the limitations imposed on the German military by the Treaty of Versailles. This was accomplished through the recruitment of more than 250,000 men into the German army and the establishment of the Luftwaffe, a new German air force. Parallel to this, Germany's industrial capacity for the production of tanks, weaponry, and ammunition was gradually expanded. And the Allied powers of Britain and France largely permitted this to occur, reasoning that sufficient time had passed since the end of the First World War to permit Germany to partially resupply. In the spring of 1936, when the Nazis reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland, there were few expressions of discontent. However, worsening issues were imminent. Concurrent with this march towards war in the 1930s, the Nazi regime initiated an aggressive implementation of its anti-Semitic rhetoric. During the mid-1930s, the primary objective of the Nazi regime was to politically marginalize the approximately 500,000 Jews residing in Germany. This was done with the intention of either relegating these individuals to the status of second-class citizens or compelling them to depart from Germany entirely, possibly in order to establish Jewish communities in the Holy Land, where endeavors had been underway since the late 19th century. The pinnacle of this campaign of coercion and political repression occurred in 1935 with the enactment of the Nuremberg Laws. These legislations, among other things, forbade Jewish-non-Jewish matrimony in Germany and restricted the economic and employment prospects of Jews throughout the nation. Throughout these events, the SD and the Gestapo played a pivotal role in the identification of Jews in Germany and the compilation of databases on particularly subversive members of the Jewish community. Thus, by the mid-1930s, Heydrich had assumed a pivotal role in the Nazi regime's anti-Semitic policies, which would grow more virulent in the years that followed. By 1936, Heydrich had ascended to a position of immense importance within the nascent Nazi state. Not only was he among the most senior members of the security services, but his expanding social, economic, and political standing reflected this. The Heydrichs were extended a growing number of invitations to social events hosted by the Reich Chancellery, where they initiated a personal association with Hitler. Heydrich impressed the Führer with his apparent unwavering allegiance to the regime and his readiness to implement even the most heinous policies. Over time, the German Chancellor would affectionately allude to Heydrich as the man with the iron heart. This was a macabre remark. Aside from this, Heydrich's stance persisted throughout his tenure on the basis of his personal rapport with Himmler. Heydrich, by virtue of his concurrent roles as the head of the SD and the Gestapo, was formerly a member of the German Privy Council starting in the spring of 1934. Furthermore, he was elected to the German Reichstag in March 1936, although it became predominantly ceremonial after that period. Concurrent with this professional progression, Reinhard also started to earn a substantial income, and the Heydrich family as a whole benefited from his political affiliations. The family was granted access to a private box throughout the Summer Olympics, which were conducted in Berlin in 1936. Thus, by virtue of Reinhard's ostensibly unwavering allegiance to the Nazi state and its brutal ideologies, the Heydrichs had ascended to one of the most prominent families in Berlin during the mid to late 1930s, notwithstanding the fact that their marriage was privately troubled due to possible infidelity on the part of both Reinhard and Lena. Additionally, Heydrich's sphere of influence was commencing to extend beyond the territorial confines of Germany. Following the nation's rearmament in the mid-1930s, there emerged an increasing desire to subjugate portions of what were considered to be Greater Germany to the Nazi regime. This encompassed Austria as well as portions of Czechoslovakia, most notably the 3 million ethnically German inhabitants of the Sudetenland. Since 1933, when the Austrian branch of the Nazis exerted extensive pressure on the Vienna government in an attempt to seize power, endeavors had been made to subjugate Austria to German rule. These efforts culminated in 1934 with the assassination of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss. Kurt Schuschnigg, his successor, instituted a nationalist regime that aimed to preserve Austria's autonomy from Germany and, in pursuit of that objective, effectively prescribed Nazism within the country. Consequently, Germany and a substantial contingent of Austrian Nazis operating out of southern Germany endeavored to undermine the Austrian state during the mid-1930s. Heydrich assumed a pivotal role in these endeavors through his collection of data on public sentiment in Austria, coordination of Nazi demonstrations in that country, and dissemination of covert Nazi propaganda across Austria, which accentuated the shared Germanic lineage between the Austrian and German populations. All of this effort ultimately bore fruit. Early in 1938, public opinion in Austria increasingly demanded that Schuschnigg legitimize the Nazi Party and contemplate the Anschluss, which would have united Austria and Germany. Therefore, he proclaimed that a referendum concerning the subject would be conducted on March 13, 1938, with Heydrich serving as a participant. For example, military and police figures, including Heydrich, were invited to a negotiation meeting between Schuschnigg and Hitler in Bavaria at the beginning of 1938 with the intention of intimidating the Austrian Chancellor. The subsequent agreement between Schuschnigg and Germany to hold a unity referendum merely incited additional hostilities. On March 12, German troops were ostensibly dispatched to Austria to ensure the referendum was conducted fairly. It was ratified that spring by an overwhelming majority, and Austria and Germany subsequently joined. Himmler and Heydrich departed immediately for Vienna, arriving on the 13th and holding court for the next 2 days at the Hotel Regina in central Vienna, where they coordinated the policing services in Austria with Austrian Nazis such as Ernst Kaltenbrunner and Kurt Daluger, now that Austria was a part of the German Reich. Heydrich had issued arrest warrants for thousands of political opponents of the new Nazi administration throughout Austria prior to their departure from the city. A comparable progression would transpire in Czechoslovakia subsequent to the German occupation of the country. This procedure was considerably more intricate than its Austrian counterpart. As a result of Czechoslovakia's post-World War I formation as a sovereign state and the Nazis' annexation and remilitary expansion into Austria, Britain and France were resolute in their efforts to avert a German occupation of the country. Therefore, in the autumn of 1939, when Hitler initiated German assertions regarding the Sudetenland, a conference was convened in Munich. At this conference, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, conceded that Germany could only annex the Sudetenland on the condition that it uphold Czech independence beyond the ethnically German region. Immediately following this concession, in early 1939, Hitler commenced preparations for the annexation of the remaining portions of Czechoslovakia. Heydrich once more played a pivotal role in these advancements by devising strategies for an invasion of Czechoslovakia that outlined the SD's approach to accompany the German army into the country in order to apprehend individuals deemed to be enemies of the state, including Social Democrats, Communists, and other adversaries of the Nazis. Despite the fact that this strategy was never implemented because Czechoslovakia was occupied without actual hostilities in March 1939, its conception demonstrates how integral the SD and other security services led by Heydrich had become to the aggressive German expansion. A significant portion of the SD and Gestapo operations in Austria and Czechoslovakia between 1938 and 1939 were devoted to the immediate identification and persecution of the Jewish population residing in both territories. Heydrich, for example, ordered the Gestapo to apprehend approximately 2,000 Jews residing in Vienna in May 1938 on the grounds that they possessed prior criminal convictions, the majority of which were obsolete and completely insignificant. More than 5,000 Austrian Jews had been forcibly deported from the country by November of that year, primarily at the hands of the SD and Gestapo. In the late 1930s, Heydrich's involvement in the expansion of the Nazi state's anti-Semitic policies was not limited to this aspect. An additional evident indication of this occurred in Germany during the nocturnal hours of November 9, 1938, when a massive barrage of assaults was launched against Jewish individuals and enterprises throughout the nation. As Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, came to a close, synagogues and Jewish-owned businesses suffered damage amounting to millions of Reichsmarks and hundreds of lives were lost. Once more, Heydrich played a pivotal role in the progression of events. Before the pogroms began, Heydrich reassured other prominent party members at a gathering of Nazi leaders in Munich that the state security agencies would not intervene in the event that attacks on Jewish businesses appeared to occur spontaneously. In Kristallnacht, Heydrich's significance cannot be overstated. The objective of the Nazi regime on November 9, 1938, was to portray the tide of violence that ravaged Germany as a popular movement, initiated by ordinary Germans, and not at the behest of the Nazi state. Prevalent among these concerns was the imperative to prevent any intervention by the state security services. In fact, they were preparing to launch interventions targeting the Jewish victims, as opposed to the tens of thousands of perpetrators. Thus, mere hours prior to the outbreak of violence, Heydrich dispatched a telegram to Müller in Berlin, his Gestapo deputy at the time, instructing him not to impede assaults on Jewish establishments and synagogues. State police were to instead make preparations to apprehend a staggering 20,000 to 30,000 Jews. Thus, Heydrich played a pivotal role in the subsequent pogrom. To provide an illustration, that night in Vienna, a city with a significant Jewish historical presence, a mere 42 synagogues were gutted and 2,000 Jewish families were forcibly displaced from their residences. The only intervention of the state security services that Heydrich supervised throughout Austria and Germany was the apprehension of Jews. A cumulative sum of 30,000 Jewish males were apprehended that evening and in the days that followed before being transported to the concentration centers, where over 1,000 perished the following year due to the deplorable conditions of their confinement. All of this served as evidence of the Nazi regime's increasingly extreme treatment of the Jewish population under its authority, as well as Heydrich's growing significance in Hitler and his followers' fervent anti-Semitic policies. This trend persisted in the months that followed, culminating in Heydrich's emergence as a key architect of the Holocaust against the European Jews in the early 1940s. The general parameters of Heydrich's position within the Nazi regime had become established by early 1939. He effectively commanded the day-to-day operations of the SD and was the preeminent figure within the police force. He possessed considerable authority over the Gestapo, which Müller had been designated to direct, and was, in essence, solely answerable to Himmler within the state's security apparatuses. Furthermore, the significance of his contributions to the Nazi regime's progressive and ever more ruthless treatment of the Jewish population and the governance of regions recently incorporated and conquered became evident with the Anschluss of Austria and the occurrences at Kristallnacht. Everything was critical at this time, as the Nazis were on the verge of colliding with Great Britain and France. After the intervention in Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939, Hitler initiated territorial claims over a significant portion of Poland on the grounds that territory had been seized from the German Reich during the formation of the new state of Poland in 1918. On this occasion, however, London and Paris were resolute in their opposition to additional German aggression. They unequivocally declared that any infringement upon Polish sovereignty would lead to armed conflict, which ultimately transpired. Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany on September 3, 1939, in response to the invasion of Poland by Germany on September 1, 1939. This occurred just days after the two powers executed a false flag operation to make Poland appear to be the aggressor, and 1 week after reaching an agreement with the Soviet Union regarding the division of Eastern Europe. With this, the Second World War began. The configuration of Germany's security services and Heydrich's position within them were both immediately impacted by the outbreak of war. In an effort to better administer the expanding population and territory under Nazi control, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, or Reich Security Main Office, was established with the explicit objective of combating all adversaries of the Reich both domestically and internationally. The Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSHA, was established formally on September 27, 1939, concurrent with the conclusion of Germany's military campaign in Poland. A number of additional security services, including the SD, Gestapo, Kripo, or criminal police, would be under the jurisdiction of the new governing body. Heydrich was given the position of founder. Furthermore, the RSHA was organized into 7 distinct departments, each responsible for a specific area of work, such as suppression of crime, in Department 5, or ideological investigation, in Department 2. The Gestapo was integrated into Department 4, which subsequently established a sub-department known as B4 to be responsible for Jewish affairs and evacuation. Adolf Eichmann, who had been employed by Heydrich for several years prior, was entrusted with the management of this RSHA division that would acquire considerable importance in the coming months. Early on in the Second World War, Hitler and the Nazis enjoyed remarkable success. The Polish military was insignificant in comparison to the German and Soviet forces, which advanced from the east shortly after Germany in accordance with a non-aggression pact that the two countries had agreed to partition Eastern Europe. As a result, by October 1939, a significant portion of Poland had fallen under German control, and the Nazis established a general government to administer the country. Indeed, the earlier expansion of German authority over regions including Czechoslovakia and Hungary, as well as the conquest of Poland, significantly increased the Jewish population at risk from the Nazi regime. A significant portion of the Jewish population in Europe migrated to Poland during the Middle Ages in response to persecution in Western and Central Europe. At the turn of the 20th century, Poland was therefore inhabited by approximately 3.5 million Ashkenazi Jews. In 1933, when the Nazis came to power, the Jewish population in Germany was just over 500,000. This significantly altered the course of the Nazis' Jewish policies. At this time, it was uncertain whether the Nazi regime in Eastern Europe would employ the same policy of intimidation to coerce the emigration of these Jews from territory held by the Nazis, or whether it would instead devise something far more malevolent. Heydrich's role in the contested Jewish question became pivotal right from the inception of the Polish occupation in the autumn of 1939. Increasingly, this was accomplished in collaboration with Adolf Eichmann, whose department within the Reich Security Main Office was tasked with Jewish affairs. A government preoccupied with identifying every Jewish person residing within its borders in an era before computer databases were available could have benefited from Eichmann's exceptional ability to identify and catalogue enormous numbers of individuals. This was an exceptionally challenging endeavor in late 1939 due to the enormous Jewish population of Poland. Preceding this early phase of the conflict, the prevailing sentiment was also one of support for the policy of oppressing the Jewish people with the intention of compelling them to abandon the Reich entirely. In pursuit of this objective, the Nazi regime was at this time documenting hundreds of thousands of Jews, many of whom were forced into ghettos and other restricted areas in cities like Warsaw, while it considered a more concrete policy. Eichmann advocated, with Heydrich's implicit consent, for the possible expulsion of millions of European Jews to the East African island of Madagascar as a solution to the alleged Jewish question. However, a far more abhorrent scheme was ultimately formulated, and Heydrich played a pivotal role in its execution. However, Theodor Herzog's actions in Poland caused distress for more than just the Jewish people. During the initial phases of the conflict, he assumed a significant role in supervising Operation Tannenberg, an endeavor aimed at Polish nationals considered adversaries of the Nazi regime. The SD had compiled lists of such individuals prior to the invasion of Poland, and thousands of them were arrested when the Germans occupied the country in September 1939. Among them were prominent intellectuals and artists, scholars, prominent members of the Roman Catholic Church, a likely lightning rod for opposition to the regime, and politicians who had been vocal in their opposition to the Nazis in Germany. A portion of this culminated in mass executions that came to be referred to as the intelligentsia mass shootings, or Intelligenzsektion. An approximate minimum of 100,000 Poles were reportedly slain or interred due to the actions of Operation Tannenberg. A portion of this even encompassed the wholesale execution of patients in Polish hospitals. By mere supervision of Operation Tannenberg during the autumn and early winter of 1939, Heydrich would have been culpable for abhorrent war crimes. However, the consequences that ensued were far more severe. As the conflict escalated throughout Europe, Heydrich's responsibilities as the head of the Reich Security Main Office grew more extensive. After achieving victory over Poland in the autumn of 1939, Hitler shifted his focus to Northern and Western Europe in 1940. During the spring, he executed covert operations to subjugate Denmark and Norway. In the early summer, he launched an aggressive military campaign against northern France and the Low Countries. Following 6 weeks of the dreaded Lightning War, Blitzkrieg, Nazi flags were affixed in Amsterdam, Brussels, and Paris, and Great Britain was the only country in Europe to stand against the Nazi tide. Following months of aerial assaults and attempts to cut Britain off with a submarine campaign against its merchant navy, the United Kingdom persisted in its resistance and ultimately emerged victorious. In the end, Hitler grew weary of the British effort and, beginning in late 1940, resolved that Germany would invade the Soviet Union, with which it had previously entered into a non-aggression pact that effectively divided Eastern Europe between the two countries and their respective leaders, Joseph Stalin and Hitler. During the summer of 1941, Germany launched the most extensive military campaign in history when it invaded the Soviet Union. At first, the endeavor proved to be highly prosperous, as it facilitated the German conquest of vast expanses of territory in eastern Poland, the Baltic, and Ukraine by autumn 1941. The German Reich's swift and unprecedented expansion in 1940 and 1941 across Eastern and Western Europe and Northern Europe, respectively, significantly broadened the scope of Heydrich's Reich Security Main Office and, consequently, the magnitude of the atrocities it oversaw. Among the most abhorrent was its failure to account for the Einsatzgruppen. These deployment groups, or task groups, were essentially SS murder squads that had been mobilized in Poland during Operation Tannenberg previously. While they followed Himmler's directives, Heydrich, in his capacity as director of the Reich Security Main Office and Himmler's unofficial deputy leader of the SS, oversaw the majority of their operations. Their behavior became exceedingly brutal in 1941. As the German army advanced into Ukraine and Russia, Einsatzgruppen members adhered closely to its front lines and carried out mass executions of Jews, Ukrainian and Russian prisoners of war, Romani citizens, and alleged political dissidents. Around 33,000 Jews were slaughtered in Babi Yar, a location in close proximity to the city of Kiev, in less than 48 hours on September 29 and 30, 1941, by Einsatzgruppen. During Heydrich's tenure as chief of the Reich Security Main Office, numerous akin occurrences transpired on the Eastern Front. By the conclusion of the conflict, the Einsatzgruppen had claimed the lives of more than 2 million individuals. An additional instrument of state intimidation in which Heydrich played a significant role was the Night and Fog Decree. This was a policy provision that permitted the unlawful seizure and detention of individuals in occupied territories who the Nazi regime deemed a threat to the state. A provision in the decree, which was officially executed in December 1941, gave rise to its nomenclature: attempted individuals shall be held in custody under the guise of night and fog. Frequently, individuals apprehended in this manner simply departed from occupied regions of Europe, such as the Low Countries or France, without their families being informed of their whereabouts. The unfortunate victims, numbering in the thousands in the years that followed, were frequently transported clandestinely to Germany, where they underwent interrogation and processing at Heydrich's SD office. Such individuals were frequently subjected to torture in an attempt to coerce them into divulging information regarding a purported conspiracy against the state. In extreme cases, they were executed or exiled to concentration camps, the latter of which was frequently equivalent to the death penalty. Consequently, thousands of inhabitants of occupied Western Europe, a region largely exempt from the most heinous atrocities committed by the Nazi regime in Eastern Europe, fell victim to Heydrich's schemes as chief of the Reich Security Services. Nevertheless, The aspect of Heydrich that continues to garner the most enduring remembrance is the pivotal role he executed in shaping the Nazi regime's approach towards what they referred to as the Jewish question. Over time, Germany's attitudes towards its Jewish communities evolved, as we have seen. During the mid-1930s, endeavors were underway to marginalize the Jewish population in Germany by revoke their citizenship and impose limitations on their economic and social liberties. The overarching objective was to exert pressure on the approximately 500,000 Jews residing in Germany to leave the country. The Kristallnacht pogroms of November 1938 further exacerbated the malevolent nature of this intimidation campaign. In the wake of the conquest of Poland in September 1939, the Jewish population under Nazi rule experienced an exponential growth. In this context, individuals like Eichmann devised bizarre schemes to expel all European Jews to Madagascar, where they would be confined in a manner resembling a vast open-air prison. The Madagascar plan, however grotesque it was, appeared comparatively benign in contrast to the final solution to the Jewish question that Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, and others were devising during the course of 1941, as the invasion of Russia was about to commence. The development of the final solution was prompted by a growing realization that the removal of millions of Jews from the German Third Reich would be an insurmountable task, especially after the British campaign in North Africa came to a halt and the potential capture of the Suez Canal, which would have obstructed a naval route to Madagascar, was eliminated. As a result, during the summer of 1941, a decision was made to have Eichmann's office in Department 4 of the Reich Security Main Office identify the entire Jewish population of countries such as Poland, Germany, Austria, and the Baltic states. From there, they would be forcibly transported to a network of dozens of concentration camps that had been established throughout Central and Eastern Europe, utilizing all of the resources under the control of Heydrich. A subset of individuals would be enlisted as slave laborers for several months, or until they were effectively starved to death. The majority, however, would be executed upon their arrival, often through exposure to lethal chemical gases like Zyklon B. This final solution was implemented most extensively at several notorious camps, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor. The Einsatzgruppen would primarily execute Jews residing in the Soviet Union as the German armies advanced eastward. Heydrich was an early participant in these schemes. The precise chronology of knowledge and timing regarding the development of the final solution is not well documented. However, on July 31, 1941, Hermann Göring authorized Heydrich to issue directives to the heads of different government departments in Germany and the occupied territories, provided that such directives were consistent with the implementation of the final solution. Although the precise details of the forthcoming events had been finalized by early autumn 1941, they were not disclosed to a broader range of officials until the winter of that same year. Upon being entrusted with this responsibility, Heydrich, Müller, and Eichmann coordinated a conference that took place on January 20, 1942, at a villa owned by the SS in the Wannsee suburb outside of Berlin. Some of the senior bureaucrats in control of government departments that would be involved in the Holocaust of Europe's Jews, identifying those to be murdered and coordinating their transport to the death camps, attended this event. Heydrich's appointment as the coordinator and leader of the Wannsee Conference is a remarkable acknowledgement of his pivotal role in the Holocaust. The precise nature of the Wannsee Conference's significance has been the subject of lengthy scholarly debate. We are aware, for instance, that Hitler, Himmler, and others had arrived at the final solution months earlier, and that experiments aimed at selecting the gases that would be used to execute the masses had been conducted in concentration camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau as early as the autumn of 1941. On January 20, 1942, therefore, no agreements were reached at the residence situated in the southwestern suburbs of Berlin. On the contrary, the importance of Wannsee resides in the implementation of the decisions that had been reached months prior. Heydrich's objective in convening a group of high-ranking administrators from the Third Reich was to guarantee the smooth operation of the genocidal policy once implementation of measures ensued in the weeks that followed. One notable aspect is the way in which genocide and mass murder were able to masquerade as bureaucratic processes. Those responsible for organizing trains, transferring personnel between camps, and completing paperwork primarily operated from desks in Berlin. Ultimately, these individuals oversaw the murder of millions of European Jews. Reinhard Heydrich occupied the apex of that bureaucratic hierarchy at the onset of the Holocaust. Heydrich's desk work was not entirely abhorrent, much to Himmler's consistent disapproval. Heydrich commenced his pilot training in 1935, coinciding with Göring's initial efforts to restructure the German Air Force into the Luftwaffe. He continued his training intermittently throughout the latter part of the 1930s, ultimately finishing his education at the flight school located in Werneuchen, northeast of Berlin, in 1939, just prior to the outbreak of war. Himmler was adamant that a senior member of the SS should not be conducting combat missions, and he initially prohibited Heydrich from doing so at the onset of the war. However, Heydrich persisted as hostilities progressed into the early 1940s and was ultimately deployed to the Norwegian front with Jagdgeschwader 77 for a month during the spring of 1940. The theater in question was comparatively secure during the war. However, his choice to enlist in the German Air Force for operations on the Eastern Front subsequent to the Soviet Union's invasion in the summer of 1941 was significantly more perilous. It thus demonstrated. On July 22, 1941, Heydrich encountered flak anti-air weapons and was shot down while flying over the Dniester River in central Ukraine. He survived the enemy territory crash land and returned to the German lines before continuing on to Berlin. When he did so, Hitler issued an explicit directive that he should never fly again. Although Heydrich was permanently grounded after a limited period of active duty on the Eastern Front, he was quickly reassigned to a new position that diverted his attention from his primary responsibilities as the head of the Reich Security Main Office and the SD. He was designated Deputy Reich Protector of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia in September 1941. The Protectorate was instituted in March 1939 subsequent to Germany's simulated annexation of Czechoslovakia. During that period, the nation was fragmented into various sections, with the Sudetenland being completely annexed by Germany in late 1938. The Protectorate of Moravia and Bohemia was among the newly formed entities. It comprised the metropolis of Prague and essentially the region surrounding what is now the Czech Republic or Czechia. Owing to its substantial economic output, significant geographical location in the heart of the Reich, and population of approximately 7.5 million, the Protectorate was an important colony of the Reich during the war years. The region was administered by a protector or viceroy designated by Hitler, who acted in the best interest of Germany. However, the protector from 1939 onward, Konstantin von Neurath, was deemed too moderate, and by the early 1940s, anti-German sentiment and resistance to Nazi authority had been intensifying there. In the autumn of 1941, a determination was reached to designate Heydrich as von Neurath's deputy and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia's governor, with the exception of one provision. Hitler selected the ideal viceroy if he desired a more strict representative. Upon his arrival in Prague, Heydrich was resolute in his intention to repress violently any manifestation of political dissent. Von Neurath was an antiquated reactionary statesman who harbored little affection for the Nazis. Hitler had appointed him Protector of Bohemia and Moravia in the spring of 1939, before the outbreak of the war, because he was a moderate and the acceptance of some European chiefs of state was crucial. His approaches had been proportionately lax. The Czech resistance's extensive distribution of communist literature constituted a significant concern. Heydrich was adamant that from day one, he would demonstrate to his new students that he was the exact antithesis. Thus, upon his arrival in Prague on September 27, Heydrich promptly instituted martial law, and the following morning he ordered the hoisting of the SS flag atop the turrets of Prague Castle. In the days that followed, he issued lists of individuals deemed to be state adversaries and subject to execution by utilizing his extraordinary abilities. A significant number of these individuals were already detained and awaited their trials, which they were now granted. Alone, 58 individuals were executed on September 30, while an additional 256 were transferred to Gestapo prisons. This merely constituted the preliminary hemorrhaging. Over 400 individuals had been executed and over 6,000 had been apprehended by the end of November 1941. By the end of 1941, 1,800 Gestapo officers had been deployed throughout the Protectorate as part of this massive security operation. A significant number of those who were apprehended were transferred to the Mauthausen-Gusen concentration camp in Upper Austria, from which a mere 4% managed to survive the war. Nevertheless, despite the fact that Heydrich's strategies swiftly earned him the moniker, the Butcher of Prague, they were also successful. As of early 1942, the Czech resistance had experienced significant depletion. Political dissidents throughout the country were deprived of the ability to communicate among isolated resistance cells due to the confiscation of dozens of wireless transmitters. Furthermore, Heydrich demonstrated astute propaganda skills by endeavoring to bribe a significant portion of the Czech populace through labor reforms and the redistribution of confiscated property wealth among the nation's labor force. In the end, this was the primary reason Heydrich was dispatched there, given that the Protectorate was vital to the German war economy, with the Skoda automobile manufacturing company in Pilsen and a significant munitions factory in Brno producing valuable automobiles for the war effort. Heydrich's tenure as governor of Bohemia and Moravia marked the pinnacle of a ruthless professional trajectory. In the weeks following his arrival, hundreds were executed, and thousands more were sent to concentration centers with a virtual death sentence. Furthermore, Heydrich initiated the forced labor of tens of thousands of Czechs, which amounted to slave labor in practice. During the initial quarter of 1942, an estimated 40,000 Czech laborers were included in a lengthy roster of individuals slated for involuntary relocation from the Protectorate to Germany. This relocation was deemed necessary to address labor shortages within the Reich, as an escalating number of German men were dispatched to Russia in the east. His level of ideological zeal was virtually unparalleled among his Nazi hierarchy counterparts as he accomplished all of this. On January 19, 1942, in an address to the Protectorate government, he asserted that he had accomplished more in 4 months than had been accomplished in the preceding 2.5 years in bringing the region under control, and that more was yet to come. The subsequent objective was to implement an accurate and unequivocal education for the Czech youth, with the intention of advancing Germanization in the nation. Despite the abhorrent nature of his tactics, they received unqualified approval in Berlin. As propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The policy pursued by Heydrich in the Protectorate is exemplary in nature." It is unsurprising that the initial brutality of Heydrich's rule over Bohemia and Moravia in late 1941 and early 1942 provoked covert opposition from the highest levels of the Czech resistance. It is true that Heydrich was well known prior to his arrival in Prague on October 3, 1941. Jan Srovik, the leader of the Czech resistance in exile in Britain, and his advisors had already decided to attempt to assassinate Heydrich a week prior to his arrival in Prague. With the intention of supervising the mission, a decision was made to dispatch Joseph Glabčík and Jan Kubas, 2 Czechoslovak resistance combatants, to Bohemia. Slovak and Czech Glabčík and Kubas, who were present in London at the time, arranged themselves expeditiously for the operation that was codenamed Operation Anthropoid. Then, on December 28, 1941, they were transported by British RAF aircraft across the Czech countryside prior to their parachuting east of Prague. They established communication with the Czech resistance on the ground and began strategizing the execution of the governor of Bohemia and Moravia in the hours that followed. 5 months would pass before they took action against Heydrich. A challenge faced by Glabčík and Kubas was Heydrich's frequent absence from the area. During the final days of 1941, when they parachuted into Bohemia, Heydrich was engaged in preparations for the Wannsee Conference. Originally slated for early December, the conference had to be rescheduled due to the Imperial Japanese attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, which precipitated the United States' entry into the Second World War. Achieving an assault on Heydrich proved to be a challenging endeavor due to the frequent disruptions in his routine caused by his numerous responsibilities. In late May, however, an opportunity arose when it was discovered that Heydrich was preparing to return to Berlin via flight, during which Hitler put forth the suggestion of deploying him to France with the intention of assuming control of the occupation government in Paris. The road leading to the airport comprised a number of sharp bends that required Heydrich's car's driver, Johannes Klein, to significantly decelerate. Furthermore, Heydrich had developed the habit of cruising in an open car during the balmy late spring weather, unaccompanied by a security detail. After analyzing the route that Gabčík would take, Kubis and his Czech resistance allies determined a specific spot where they would ambush Heydrich's vehicle and execute the governor. The specified date was May 27, 1942. Around 10:30 a.m. on the morning of the 27th, Heydrich departed from his location. The ambush location chosen by Gabčík and Kubis was in close proximity to a sharp turn on the road that Heydrich would be traversing, necessitating the vehicle to reduce its speed in order to execute the turn. Gabčík emerged from his concealment place that morning as the car approached and attempted to engage it with the Sten submachine gun. Despite this, his weapon malfunctioned and was unable to discharge. Heydrich, who believed Gabčík was acting alone, would have executed the life-threatening maneuver if he had simply instructed Klein to decelerate and remove himself from the area at that moment. Had he done so, Klein would have survived. However, Heydrich, believing Gabčík was acting alone, instructed Klein to decelerate and then drew his Luger pistol to execute the resistance fighter. Kubis emerged from his concealment place at this moment and hurled a grenade towards Heydrich's vehicle. Although it deflected to some degree away from the vehicle upon impact, the resulting detonation was substantial, causing Heydrich to sustain injuries to his lung, chest, spleen, and ribcage. However, he remained alive and a gunfight ensued prior to the escape of Gabčík and Kubis. Heydrich subsequently lost consciousness by the side of the road as Klein, the driver, pursued the two assailants. Gabčík and Kubis erroneously believed that the assassination attempt had been thwarted as they departed the scene. Heydrich was critically unwell despite his continued existence. Klein was unable to return in time to transport Gabčík to the hospital because Gabčík wounded Klein in the leg as he pursued him. In its place, he was transported to the nearby Bulovka Hospital in Prague after a van was waved down and a Czech woman who had been in the vicinity approached him after the gunfight. In addition to performing a splenectomy to remove the majority of his damaged spleen, another operation was conducted to address the chest wound and debride his lungs and diaphragm. Nevertheless, all efforts were in vain. Despite appearing to recover in the days that followed, as evidenced by his ability to communicate when Himmler paid him a visit on June 2, Heydrich lapsed into a coma on June 3 and passed away the following day. The precise etiology remains uncertain in light of the variety of injuries he had incurred. However, sepsis was the most likely cause. At the time, he was 38 years old. One of the most peculiar aspects of the assassination was that Heydrich, who ordinarily took his personal security extremely seriously. Alarm chimes connected the entire Heydrich residence in Berlin to nearby police stations in an effort to apprehend intruders promptly. The head of the Reich Security Main Office had vehicles equipped with machine guns and pistols as he navigated the German capital, in the event that he were ever ambushed in Prague as Gabčík and Kubis had. Remarkably, Heydrich had taken personal responsibility for drafting safety protocols that senior members of the regime and the Nazi Party were expected to adhere to throughout the duration of the war. Furthermore, the Gestapo and other security services operating under Heydrich's overarching command had received a multitude of reports in the weeks preceding his assassination, which claimed that various factions within the Allies, including the Czech resistance, intended to attempt his assassination. One of these entailed the apprehension and interrogation of a Russian national who was apprehended in Warsaw while en route to Prague carrying a concealed sniper rifle concealed in a compartment of his luggage. An additional report had specifically mentioned Czech resistance combatants who, like Gabčík and Kubis, had parachuted into the country. It is puzzling that Heydrich would ride around Prague in an open car without a formal security detail. However, he seems to have regarded this as a matter of political principle. A significant security presence surrounding him would undermine his reputation as the stern ruler of the region and give the impression that he dreaded the Czechs. It would have been an ultimately disastrous miscalculation on his behalf to hold this view. Bohemia and Moravia experienced severe retaliatory actions in the weeks that ensued as a consequence of Heydrich's assassination. For the most rudimentary conceivable ties to the resistance, entire villages were subjected to genocide, with a minimum of 13,000 individuals being arrested. Approximately 20 kilometers from Prague, in the village of Lidice, one of these events led to the deaths of close to 200 civilians. Hundreds more were detained and transported to the concentration camps, where the majority perished in the months that followed. Additionally, the brutal assault led to the discovery of Gabčík and Kubis. 2 weeks after Heydrich's death in the hospital, on June 18, 1942, the pair, along with a number of other Czech resistance members, were cornered in the church of St. Cyril and St. Methodius in Prague. After a 6-hour gunfight ensued, dozens of German soldiers were slain or wounded prior to the successful assault on the church. Gabčík, along with a number of others, took their own lives prior to being recovered. Kubis, who was injured by a grenade explosion but unable to self-destruct, succumbed to his wounds in the immediate aftermath of the Germans' entry into the structure. Despite this, the violence persisted and retaliation against the Czech people continued for weeks, as the inhabitants of Bohemia and Moravia were severely punished for the assassination of Heydrich. During World War II, Heydrich was the most prominent member of the Nazi regime to be assassinated. In light of this, his funeral was meticulously planned and significantly utilized to advance Nazi propaganda objectives. On June 7, 1942, his remains were initially displayed in the atrium of Prague Castle, where tens of thousands of Czech citizens were encouraged to pay their respects. His remains were subsequently transported to Berlin, where the primary funeral rites were conducted in the Mosaic Room of the Reich Chancellery on June 9. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, oversaw the entrance of Hitler and others during the performance of Richard Wagner's Twilight of the Gods. Hitler, who privately held Heydrich responsible for his own assassination, placed the Blood Order Medal, the highest honor bestowed by the Nazi Party, in his deceased colleague's casket. Himmler delivered the eulogy. He was subsequently interred in the Berlin Military Cemetery in Wallenfriedhof. Despite Hitler's desire for the construction of a monumental structure at this location following the war, Heydrich's interment remains unmarked at present. In the days that followed his funeral, the Nazi media lionized the individual who was primarily accountable for the execution of the Holocaust among nearly all members of the Nazi regime, portraying him as the archetypal Aryan. Heydrich might have ultimately been held accountable for his abhorrent deeds, since the Third Reich was doomed even if he had not been assassinated outside Prague on a summer day in 1942. In the late autumn of 1941, when he arrived in Bohemia and Moravia, the German war effort appeared to be flawless. As the German forces advanced rapidly eastward into Russia and towards the strategic cities of Moscow and Leningrad, Heydrich played a pivotal role in establishing Einsatzgruppen, which carried out their lethal operations behind the front lines. During the early winter of 1941, however, while Heydrich presided over mass executions and arrests in Prague, the situation in Russia deteriorated. Beyond the major cities, the German advance halted in the face of the Russians' most formidable resistance the Germans had ever encountered. Then winter arrived, and it became clear that the German Wehrmacht's logistical preparations had been abysmal, as tens of thousands of German soldiers perished or became incapacitated in the Russian winter due to their lack of cold-resistant clothing. The Eastern Front had entered a state of stalemate by the time Heydrich was assassinated in the summer of 1942. However, the swift German victory in France in 1940 appeared progressively more elusive. Germany's situation deteriorated dramatically in the months that followed Heydrich's passing. Hitler's objectives on the Eastern Front hinged on securing triumph over the Russians during the winter of 1942 at the southern city of Stalingrad. This decisive battle culminated in a spectacular Russian triumph in February 1943, subsequent to which the German Sixth Army capitulated. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the Germans were driven back into Ukraine and subsequently Poland as the Russians launched an assault. A year later, in the summer of 1943, the Western Allies, under the leadership of the United States and Great Britain, established a Western Front in France, following which a Southern Front was established in Italy. The Allies finally advanced into Germany from the east and west in 1945. Joseph Goebbels and other high-ranking Nazis, including Hitler, committed suicide in Berlin on April 30, 1945, prior to their apprehension. Germany formally ceased hostilities in Europe 1 week later, thus concluding the conflict in that region. Senior members of the regime and the SS were tried in the city of Nuremberg in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and the majority of them were subsequently executed for their crimes, including Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Heydrich's successor as chief of the Reich Security Main Office and the SD. Had Heydrich managed to survive, he would have been faced with the decision of either committing suicide, fleeing Europe in an attempt to avoid execution, or standing trial. During the Second World War, Reinhard Heydrich supervised the expansion of genocidal policies and mass murder throughout Europe. In many ways, he was the most vile of all the Nazis. This is perhaps a little peculiar given that his ascent to the position was, in numerous respects, so ordinary. Early on, he displayed anti-Semitic inclinations, which were possibly intensified by the fact that his classmates had criticized him during his teenage years due to his purported Jewish heritage. However, he refrained from overtly pursuing these ambitions as an adult, and his professional path during the 1920s was comparatively ordinary for an individual aspiring to become a naval officer. Nevertheless, this relatively ordinary progression was disrupted in 1931 when his soon-to-be wife simultaneously expelled him from the German Navy and elevated him to the highest levels of the Nazi Party. Subsequently, when Heinrich Himmler discerned that Heydrich possessed an exceptional aptitude for counterintelligence and work in the security services, a species of bureaucratic demon emerged, one whose deeds were so ruthless and calculated that not even Adolf Hitler could refer to him as the Iron Heart. The crimes Heydrich committed in the decade leading up to his death are extremely difficult to quantify. In the 1930s, he oversaw the arrest and terrorization of tens of thousands of individuals across Germany as the head of the SD, the Gestapo, and finally the Reich Security Main Office. This practice was later expanded to countries such as Austria as the Reich expanded in 1938. He oversaw Operation Tannenberg, in which tens of thousands of Poles were executed and murdered without trial or due process, as soon as the conflict broke out. His involvement in Einsatzgruppen operations had already commenced at this juncture. The organization would go on to execute an estimated 2 million individuals in Eastern Europe throughout the duration of the conflict. Then, throughout 1941, Heydrich and others affiliated with the Reich Security Main Office were intimately involved in the development of the final solution, a concentration camp system that would be utilized to mass murder millions of European Jews in Eastern and Central Europe. Heydrich orchestrated and supervised the January 1942 conference in Wannsee, which was where senior Reich administrators were briefed on the impending Holocaust and the dreadful process was officially launched. Surprisingly, when weighed against the entirety of his career, Heydrich's ruthless and brutal suppression of political dissent during his brief tenure as governor of Bohemia and Moravia appears to be a mere footnote. In light of the foregoing, it is certain to assert that Reinhard Heydrich personified the quintessence of the malevolence that characterized the Third Reich. In your opinion, what is Reinhard Heydrich like? Did he exemplify the ideal Nazi? Were the Allies justified in devising a plan to eliminate him? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.